Sometimes the things you see in the shadows are more than just shadows.
I was lucky enough to be born on an island just off of Japan called Okinawa. I attended public school, and while many of the years were great, there was one horrible night that I would never forget. At the time, I was only 11 years old, and my class was going through Japanese history, and we happened to come across a creepy story about a forest on the mainland called the Okigahara Forest, or better known today as the Suicide Forest. Our teacher filled our heads with horrific stories of the mainland and how we were lucky to live on post at Camp Henson. As the son of a Marine, I lived on post with the other military brats. Although we had our teacher and our ear telling us how lucky we were, we all had horror stories of our own. But there was one story that we told that frightened even the bravest of us. The demon in the woods. Just off post was a large forest that, at the time, the military left alone. The kids in my class had come up with a story that not even the Marines would dare enter the forest, in fear that they would be killed by the demon, and their bodies would be dragged out into the woods to be devoured and never seen again. I, of course, believed this to be bull. I called out those kids, Martin Fox and James Pruitt, telling them that they were full of it, and that nothing was in those woods except the animals that lived there. Well, of course, Martin and James didn't like being called liars, so they said, "Oh yeah? How do you know?" And I said that Marines aren't afraid of anything, and that one would be more than enough to handle an army of demons. I thought this mostly because one of my dad's favorite sayings was, "Regroup hell," so I figured that if they would regroup in hell, surely they wouldn't be afraid of any demon, right? James busted out with the mother of all challenges. "Prove it. I triple dog dare you to go into the woods." He completely skipped the double dog dare, the bastard. So of course, I had to accept. It was only walking into the woods. So I agreed, but Martin wasn't done. He added the stipulation that it had to be at night. Late at night. I couldn't very well back down now, so I agreed to their terms. I waited until my parents were fast asleep, and I hopped on my Huffy and rode out to the meeting place off post. I was silently hoping that Martin and James would chicken out, but to my dismay, there they were, waiting, flashlights and all. When I rode up, I hopped off my bike and held out my hand for one of their flashlights. "No flashlights. You have to go in the dark," James said. "That's not part of the dare," I protested, half wanting to chicken out of the whole thing. "Chicken," Martin responded, adding a few clucks and waving of his arms. Screw these guys, I thought. So I let my bike hit the road, and I marched off into the woods, listening to their jeers from behind. "Don't forget 100 steps," Martin yelled. I didn't respond, and just clicked my teeth and made my way into the forest, step after step. The brush was pretty thick, and after a while, I couldn't even make out the glow of their flashlights behind me. The treetops blocked the moonlight, so it was almost pitch black. So I just kept walking until I hit that 100 steps, and silently congratulated myself. My success would be short-lived. I spotted what looked like a white flash out of the corner of my eye, and I immediately turned, fully expecting to spot Martin or James trying to scare me. "I know that's you guys," I called out, but there was no response. I stood quietly for a moment, hoping to spot one of them make the mistake of using the flashlight again, but nothing came. That's when I heard it, the sound of a twig breaking directly behind me. I turned around to try and catch the bastards, but what I felt wasn't a small kid, but a huge figure towering over me.
You smoke?
A voice whispered in the dark, breaking the silence. His voice sent chills down my spine. I wasn't going to stick around to find out who or what said that. I turned and booked it. I ran as fast as I could, not looking back, hoping that I wasn't going to be followed. I ended up tripping and knocking myself out. Cliché, I know, but it was pitch black. The next thing I know, I start to regain consciousness, and I can feel myself being dragged by my feet. I couldn't move. I couldn't cry out. I couldn't do anything. I was solely at the mercy of whatever it was that was dragging me along, and I lost consciousness again. The next time I opened my eyes, it was the sun rising that greeted me. I sat up and realized that I was sitting in my front yard. I looked around and couldn't figure out how I had gotten there. Martin and James probably dragged me back, so I just ran inside and got ready for school. I decided it was best not to let my parents know that I had snuck out, in fear of the whooping I would probably get. When I got to school, Martin and James were crying to our teacher, Mrs. Day, that I was taken by the demon, and when I walked in the classroom, they were absolutely shocked to see me there. It was at that moment that I realized that they weren't the ones who brought me home. So how the hell did I end up back on post? Who knew where I lived? It wasn't until many years later that I overheard my dad telling my nephew a horror story about Camp Henson. An old World War II Marine that had been killed in battle roamed the base at night, and sometimes he would approach people and say,
"Got a light?"
And after getting his cigarette lit, he would vanish into thin air. When I heard that story, I knew how I got home.
Futa Kuchiona, or the Two-Mouthed Woman, is a Japanese urban legend about a woman who was cursed with having two mouths, one normal mouth at the front, and another, hidden, monstrous mouth in the back of her head. Futa Kuchiona is a monstrous woman with a tiny mouth. However, on the back of her head, hidden beneath her hair, she has a huge second mouth. The woman's skull splits apart, revealing lips, teeth, and a tongue. Although she appears to never eat, the mouth in the back of her head is ravenous and consumes huge quantities of food. They say that the big mouth has a mind of its own and speaks to the woman, mumbling spiteful and threatening things to her. The mouth will harass the woman and threaten her, demanding food. It will screech obsessively and cause the woman tremendous pain until it is fed. The monstrous mouth can also control the woman's hair, making it snake out like tentacles, grabbing food and shoveling it down its throat. There is some disagreement in Japan as to Futa Kuchiona's origins and how she got her second mouth. One story from Japanese folklore tells of an old miser who lived by himself in a small village. He never got married because he hated spending money. He thought that if he took a wife, he would have to pay for her food, and he could not bear the idea of parting with his wealth. It so happened that he came across a young woman who did not eat a thing and immediately asked her to marry him. Because she seemed to never eat and was a hard worker, the old miser was thrilled that he had found the woman of his dreams, and the couple were very happy together. However, he began to wonder why his stores of rice were steadily decreasing. One day, the man pretended to leave for work, but instead stayed behind to spy on his wife. To his horror, he saw his wife's hair part on the back of her head, her skull split wide open, revealing a gaping, deformed mouth. Her hair reached out like tentacles, grasping handfuls of rice and shoveling it into its monstrous mouth. When the woman noticed her husband had discovered her secret, she attacked him and tried to strangle him. He managed to get away and hid in the mountains. Weeks later, when he worked up the courage to return, he found the woman had gone, and all of his stores of rice had been eaten. The old man never married again. In another story, a man's wife died, leaving him with a daughter to care for. The man remarried, but his new wife was a very mean and vindictive person. Together, they had a second child, another daughter. However, they were poor, and there was barely enough food to go around. The new wife decided to keep her own daughter fed while she starved the other girl. The man's daughter eventually died of starvation. Not long afterwards, the man was out in the garden chopping wood for the fire. He accidentally swung his axe incorrectly and embedded it in the back of his wife's head. There was a lot of blood, and he expected the woman to die. She survived, but the open wound never healed. Instead, it formed into a huge, drooling mouth, complete with teeth and a tongue. The woman was in tremendous pain, and the only way to make it stop was to feed the deformed mouth. It demanded more and more food to keep it satisfied. Eventually, the mouth started making sounds and started talking. One day, while the woman was asleep, the hideous mouth spoke to her husband and confessed, "I am cursed because I killed your daughter by starving her to death."
One of my relatives passed away suddenly. I never met the woman. She had a daughter who was 4 years old. The little girl's name was Yuki. Her father wasn't able to raise her on his own, so he asked my aunt to care for her. The little girl refused to be left alone and never left my aunt's side. It started to become a problem. My aunt couldn't go anywhere without Yuki. She constantly needed attention. Even my aunt's own daughter started to get jealous. One day, my aunt told me she had to go out of town for a couple of days and asked if I would babysit the little girl for her. I said it would be my pleasure. I lived alone and I could do with some company. A few days later, my aunt dropped Yuki off in my apartment. As she was leaving, she took the little girl aside and said, "Yuki, please be good. Behave yourself." When my aunt was gone, I tried to talk to Yuki and play some games with her, but the little girl's behavior was very strange. She had a teddy bear tucked tightly under her arm and would never let go of it. She never smiled, she never spoke. All she ever did was sit quietly in the corner and stare at the wall. It made me kind of uneasy. I was trying to find something that would entertain her. I had just bought a new digital camera and decided to let Yuki play with my old one. When she saw the camera, her eyes lit up. I showed her how to use it and she went all around my apartment, taking pictures of everything. There was a bright smile on her face. That evening, I discovered how difficult Yuki was to deal with. Whenever I tried to leave the room, she started crying and screaming out my name. I couldn't leave her alone or she would create a huge fuss. She even insisted on going with me to the bathroom, which was very embarrassing. At bedtime, she refused to stay in the spare room and insisted on sleeping in my bed. I read her a bedtime story and after a while, I managed to get her to go to sleep. But that was when I noticed her teddy bear. One of its legs was charred and blackened, as if it had been burned. It made me wonder. In the middle of the night, I was awoken by a strange noise. When I turned over, I saw that there was something wrong with Yuki. The little girl's body was trembling and shaking. Her eyes were wide open. Her teeth were chattering and tears were streaming down her cheeks. I held her close and asked her what was wrong. "She's looking at me again," she mumbled. "Who is?" I asked in surprise. "The dark woman," replied Yuki. She wouldn't say anything more. I tried to tell her it was just her imagination, but she kept shaking her head and whimpering. It took me a long time to get her to go back to sleep. The next day, Yuki was fine again. She loved playing with my digital camera. When it was time for her to go home, I told her she could keep it. Yuki hugged me. Although she didn't say anything, I could tell she was overjoyed. I dropped the little girl off at my aunt's house and stayed to have a cup of tea. My aunt thanked me for taking care of Yuki, and we spent a while chatting at the kitchen table. "Poor little thing," said my aunt. "She hasn't said a word since her mother died." I couldn't contain my curiosity. "How did Yuki's mom die?" I asked. A strange look came over my aunt's face. "She died in a fire." "How did the fire start?" I asked. "Well," my aunt hesitated, unwilling to talk about it. "It's a very sad story. She committed suicide. Yuki's mother was a very troubled woman. She poured gasoline over herself and lit a match. She burned herself alive." "Oh my God," I exclaimed. "How horrible." "Yes," said my aunt. "Her family was so shocked. They hushed it up and pretended it was an accident. We had a small funeral, but only close relatives were invited. Yuki wasn't there. She doesn't even know her mother is dead. She thinks her mother is just on a long holiday. We haven't had the heart to tell her the truth." "Poor Yuki," I murmured. My aunt nodded her head sadly. "Poor Yuki." A few days after that, Yuki died. My aunt was trying to change Yuki's behavior. At night, she forced the little girl to sleep in her own bedroom. Even though Yuki screamed and cried, my aunt left her there alone and locked the door. In the morning, she found Yuki lying motionless in bed, and the poor little girl was dead. Nobody could understand what had happened. The coroner could not determine the cause of death. There wasn't a mark on her body. She was perfectly healthy. She had just mysteriously died during the night. There was no explanation. After the funeral, I went back to my aunt's house. Everyone was very sad. She returned the digital camera I had given to Yuki. I took it home with me. It was something to remember her by. The memory card was full of random photos that Yuki had taken. I browsed through them, wiping a tear away from my eye. There were pictures of my apartment, pictures of my aunt's house, flowers, dogs, toys, candy, silly pictures that a child would take. Then, I came to the last picture, and it made my blood run cold. My hands were trembling. I wanted to scream, but nothing would come out. The timestamp on the photo showed that it had been taken the night Yuki died. Here is the last picture that poor little girl ever took with my digital camera.
The Kuchisaka Onna, also known as the slit-mouthed woman, is a scary Japanese urban legend about a disfigured Japanese woman who brandishes large scissors and preys on children. She has an enormous slit mouth which extends from ear to ear in a horrible permanent smile. The slit-mouthed woman walks the streets of Japan wearing a surgical mask and hunting for children. If you cross her path, she will stop you and ask you a question. If you give her the wrong answer, there will be horrible consequences. Picture the scene. You are walking home from school and your path takes you down a deserted city street. Suddenly, you hear a faint noise coming from the shadows. You glance over and see a beautiful woman standing there. She has long black hair and is wearing a beige trench coat. A surgical mask covers the lower half of her face. In Japan, wearing a surgical mask is not uncommon during flu season to prevent spreading germs. She steps out of the shadows and blocks your path. "Am I beautiful?" she asks. Before he can answer, she tears off her mask, revealing a hideously deformed face. Her huge mouth is sliced from ear to ear and gapes open, revealing rows of sharp teeth and a big red, disgusting tongue twisting and twirling inside. Am I beautiful now? She screams. Terrified, you struggle to answer her. If you say no, she pulls out a huge pair of scissors and kills you immediately, chopping off your head. If you say yes, she takes her scissors and slices your mouth from ear to ear, making you look just like her. If you try to run away, she will hunt you down and kill you by slicing you in two. The only way to escape from Kushisaka Ana is to give a non-committed answer. If you say you look average or you look normal, she will be confused, giving you just enough time to run away. There are many rumors about how Kushisaka Ana got her horrible disfigured mouth. Some say that her slit mouth is a result of plastic surgery that went horribly wrong. Others say that she was injured in a terrible car crash. Some even believe that she is an escaped mental patient who was so demented that she cut her own mouth apart. According to one legend, years ago in Japan, there lived a very beautiful woman who was extremely vain and self-absorbed. Her husband was a very jealous and brutal man, and he became convinced that she was cheating on him. In a fit of rage, he took a sword and slit her mouth from ear to ear, screaming, "Who will think you're beautiful now?" She became a vengeful spirit and began walking the streets of Japan wearing a surgical mask to hide her terrible scars. The slit-mouthed woman's reign of terror began in the spring and summer of 1979 when rumors began to spread throughout Japan about sightings of the Kushisaka Ana hunting down children. The story spread like wildfire and actually created scares in many towns. Police increased their patrols and schools sent teachers to walk students home in groups. In 2004, South Korea was plagued by reports of a red-masked woman who was chasing children. In 2007, a coroner found some old records from the late 70s about a woman who was chasing little children but was hit by a car and died shortly after. Her mouth was ripped from ear to ear. The US had its own version of Kushisaka Ana. There were rumors about a clown who appeared in public bathrooms and accosted children, asking, "Do you want death or a happy smile?" If they chose happy smile, he took out a knife and slit their mouth from ear to ear.
A 19-year-old girl was attending university in Japan. In her second year of study, she decided that she wanted to improve her English, so she transferred to a university in the United States. She had always wanted to live in the USA, but she did not anticipate how difficult the change would be for her. The course she was studying required her to submit a lot of reports. While she was attending the university in Japan, she submitted all her reports in Japanese. However, in the American university, all of the reports had to be in English. This caused a big problem for the girl because her command of the English language was not very good. She found that she had to spend hours upon hours checking the spelling and grammar while typing up her reports. Another problem was that she didn't own a laptop. Luckily, the university library had a computer lab with approximately 50 computers that was open 24 hours a day. Unfortunately, there were always long queues of people waiting to use them. Every morning, she had to attend lectures, and every evening, she had to queue for a computer. This all took its toll, and after a while, the girl became fed up with the daily grind. Late one night, after the Japanese girl had been sitting hunched over a computer for hours, she began to get restless. It was almost 2 a.m. and she was extremely tired. It was getting difficult for her to keep her eyes open. Leaning back in her chair, she yawned and stretched out her arms in front of her. Her fingers happened to nudge the computer keyboard aside. She was about to begin typing again when she happened to glance down and noticed that there was something scratched into the desk under the keyboard. It seemed to be an internet URL. She thought it was odd that someone had taken the time to engrave a website address in the wood, and out of a combination of curiosity and boredom, she decided to look it up. After typing the website address into the browser, she waited a few seconds and a page appeared on the screen. What she saw horrified her. There was a picture of a man covered in blood lying on the floor of a dimly lit room. It looked so real that it turned her stomach and made her feel like throwing up. Looking closely, she saw a caption below the image. It read, "Dumb guy aged around 30, killed by me today." A chill went down her spine as she stared at the gruesome picture. The girl immediately shut down her computer and, grabbing her handbag, she hurried out of the computer lab. She returned to her dorm room alone and spent the night tossing and turning in bed. The horrible photo she had seen was never far from her mind. Could it be real? She asked herself. Maybe it's just a hoax. People post crazy pictures on the internet all the time. The web is full of weird and disturbing websites. Try as she might, the girl couldn't shake the sneaking suspicion that she had stumbled across the website of a murderer. Worst of all, he seemed to be boasting about his crime. The next morning after breakfast, her curiosity got the better of her. She skipped her first lecture and headed straight for the computer labs. When she found a free computer, she sat down, typed in the URL, and held her breath. Perhaps what she had seen last night was just her imagination. When the website appeared, she saw that the image had changed. Instead of a dead body in a dimly lit room, the photo showed a blonde woman walking down a busy street. The girl breathed a sigh of relief. The picture appeared to have been taken from a distance, and the woman seemed unaware that she was being photographed. The caption underneath read, "Stupid woman, around 25 years old." That evening, the girl went back to her dorm room and didn't speak to anyone. She was still unnerved and couldn't stop thinking about the strange website. As soon as she woke up the next morning, she dressed and went back to the computer lab. There was hardly anyone around. She sat down at a free computer and typed in the website URL. To her horror, the image had changed again. It was the same dimly lit room, but this time a blonde woman lay on the floor. Blood was flowing from her nose and mouth. There was a large knife sticking out of her chest. Under the photo were the words, "Stupid woman, around 25 years old, killed by me today." The girl was horrified and immediately contacted the police. Over the phone, it was difficult for her to explain the situation. Her English was not very good, and she spent a long time repeating herself and trying to find the right words to describe what she had found. In the end, she wasn't even sure if the police had understood what she was trying to say. However, they took her name, address, phone number, and the URL of the website. When she hung up the phone, the girl was shaking. She couldn't seem to get the awful pictures out of her mind. She had to take another look. That evening, she returned to the computer lab again and, with mixed feelings of fear and curiosity, she entered the URL of the website. When the page loaded, she discovered that the image that had been there just a few hours before was gone. Instead, there was a picture of a girl taken from behind. She had short black hair, a lime green t-shirt, and was sitting in front of a computer. The girl got a sinking feeling in the pit of her stomach, and she broke out into a cold sweat. She recognized the hair. She recognized the clothes. She was staring at a picture of herself. Her name, address, and phone number were written under the picture, followed by a single sentence. "You are my next internet star." The Japanese girl ran out of the computer lab and went straight back to her dorm room. She packed up her belongings, and by the next morning, she was on a flight back to Japan. She never returned to the United States again.
Kun is described as an unidentifiable white squiggle moving back and forth in the distance. Nobody knows exactly what it looks like, because anyone who has seen it has lost their mind. One Japanese man tells an encounter he had as a child with a kun. When I was young, my parents brought my older brother and I to visit my grandmother and grandfather. We didn't see her very much, because she lived very far out the countryside in Akita. As soon as we arrived at our grandparents' house, my brother and I went out to play. The air was much fresher and cleaner than it was in the city. We walked through the rice fields, enjoying the wide open spaces. The sun was high in the sky, and there was no breeze. The heat was stifling after a while. I started to get tired. Then my brother stopped suddenly. He was staring at something in the distance. "What are you looking at?" I asked. "That thing over there," he replied. The rice fields stretched as far as the eye could see, and the area was completely deserted. I squinted my eyes, but I couldn't make out what it was. Far away, across the fields, there was this white thing, about the size of a person. It was moving and wriggling as if it was fluttering in the breeze. "Maybe it's a ScareKrow," I said. "That's not a ScareKrow," my brother replied. "Scarecrows don't move like that." "Maybe it's a sheet then," I said. "No, it's not a sheet. he replied. "There are no other houses around here. Besides, there's no wind. But it's still moving and wriggling. The heck is that thing?" I had a strange and uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach. My brother ran back to the house, and when he returned, he was carrying a pair of binoculars. "Oh, can I see?" I said excitedly. I made a grab for the binoculars, but he pushed me back. "No, me first," he said with a chuckle. "I'm the oldest. You can have a look when I'm done." As soon as my brother put the binoculars up to his eyes, I noticed his expression suddenly changed. His face grew pale, and he broke out into a cold sweat. He dropped the binoculars to the ground, and I could see the fear in his eyes. "What was it?" I asked nervously. My brother replied slowly, "There it is. There it is. There it is." It was not my brother's voice. Without another word, he turned and started walking back to the house. Something didn't feel right. With trembling hands, I bent down and picked up the binoculars, but I was too scared to look through them. In the distance, the white object was still twisting and turning. Just then, my grandfather came running over. "What are you doing with those binoculars?" he asked. "Nothing," I replied. "Just looking at that white thing over there." "What?" he shouted. "You shouldn't look at that." He snatched the binoculars from my grasp. "Did you see it?" he demanded angrily. "Did you look through the binoculars?" "No," I said in a meek voice. "Not yet." My grandfather sighed with relief. "Good," he said. "That's good." Without knowing why, I was sent back to the house. When I walked into the kitchen, everyone was crying. My brother was rolling around on the ground, laughing like a crazy person. He was on his back and his body was wriggling and twisting, just like that white thing in the distance. I couldn't understand what was going on. It was horrible to see him like that. I burst into tears myself. He wasn't my brother anymore. He had completely lost his mind. The next day, my parents decided to take us home. My grandmother and grandfather stood on their porch, waving sadly to us as the car pulled away. I sat in the back seat with my brother, wiping the tears from my eyes. My brother was still laughing like a mental patient. They had to tie him up to stop him from moving around. His face was twisted into a wide smile. He looked like he was happy, but when I saw his eyes, I realized he was crying. It sent a chill down my spine. His cheeks were wet with tears, but he just kept laughing and laughing. My father pulled over to the side of the road and got out of the car. He took out the binoculars and furiously smashed him on the street. Then, without saying anything, he got back into the car and kept driving. Another Japanese man tells his experience with the twister kun-kun when he was a young boy. When I was a little boy, I lived in a small town by the seashore in Chiba Prefecture. One evening, my uncle took me for a walk on the beach. As we strolled down the strand, I looked out to the sea and noticed something white in the distance. It was a long thing, swaying back and forth. I wondered what it could be. "What's that thing in the sea?" I asked my uncle. He gazed at it, and I saw his eyes grow wide, and his face turn pale. There was a terrified look in his eyes. He couldn't stop staring at it. "Run for your life!" he shouted frantically. I didn't know what was going on, but I was scared, so I ran back home and told my grandfather. He went pale. "That's a kun-kun," he said. "You're lucky to get away from it. You should never look directly at it. Where's your uncle?" "He's still at the seashore," I replied, my voice shaking. "I've got to rescue my son," my grandfather said as he took off as fast as he could to the seashore. I followed close behind him, worried and frightened. From a distance, I could see my uncle standing on the beach. It was as if he was frozen on spot, staring at the white meandering thing far out to sea. My grandfather broke a branch off the tree and approached my uncle, muttering some kind of prayer under his breath. He kept his eyes cast down, careful not to look at the white thing. My grandfather managed to drag my uncle away and brought him home. Although my uncle was saved, he suffered from fits of madness and insanity the rest of his life. Since it happened, he has been in and out of mental homes many times. He was never the same after that.
My grandparents lived in Japan. Every summer, my parents would take me there on holiday to visit them. They lived in a small village and they had a large backyard. I loved to play there during the summer. When we arrived, my grandparents also welcomed me with open arms, and I was their only grandchild, so they spoiled me. The last time I saw them was this summer when I was 8 years old. As usual, my grandparents booked a flight to Japan, and we drove from the airport to my grandparents' house. They were delighted to see me and had a lot of little presents to give me. My parents wanted to have some time by themselves, so after a few days, they took a trip to another part of Japan, leaving me in the care of my grandmother and grandpa. One day, I was playing out in the backyard. My grandparents were inside the house. It was a hot summer's day and I lay down on the grass to rest. I stared up at the clouds and enjoyed the feeling of the soft rays of the sun and the gentle breeze. Just as I was about to get up, I heard a strange sound. Pull, 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 pull. I didn't know what it was, and it was hard to figure out where it was coming from. It sounded almost like somebody was making the noise themselves, as if they were just saying po, 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 over and over again in a deep masculine voice. I was looking around, searching for the source of the noise when I suddenly noticed something on top of the tall hedges that enclosed the backyard. I saw a straw hat. It wasn't resting on the hedge, it was behind it. That's where the sound was coming from. Paw, paw, paw. And then, the hat began to move, as if someone was wearing it. The hat stopped at a small gap in the edge, and I could see a face peering through. It was a woman. But the edges were high, almost 8 feet tall. I was surprised at how tall this woman was. I wondered if she was wearing stilts or some sort of huge high-heeled shoes. Then, a split second later, she walked off and the strange noise disappeared with her, fading into the distance. Bewildered, I got up and wandered back into the house. My grandparents were in the kitchen drinking tea. I sat down at the table and, after a while, I told my grandparents what I had seen. They weren't really paying attention to me until I mentioned the distinctive sound. Paw, paw. As soon as I said that, both of them suddenly froze. Grandma's eyes grew wide and she covered her mouth with her hands. Grandpa's face became very serious and he grabbed me by the arm. "This is very important," he said, in an intense voice. "You must tell us exactly. How tall was she?" "As tall as the garden hedge," I replied, beginning to get scared. My grandfather bombarded me with questions. Where was she standing? When did this happen? What did you do? Did she see you? I tried to answer all his questions as best I could. He suddenly rushed out to the hallway and made a phone call. I couldn't hear what he was saying. I looked over at my grandma, and she was trembling. Grandpa came barging back into the room and spoke to my grandmother. "I've got to go for a little while," he said. "You stay here with the child. Don't take your eyes off him for a second." "What's going on, Grandpa?" I cried. He looked at me with a sad expression in his eyes and said, "You've been liked by Hachisaku-sama." With that, he hurried out, got into his truck and drove off. I turned to my grandmother and cautiously asked, "Who's Hachisaku-sama?" "Don't worry," she replied in a shaky voice. "Grandpa will do something. There's no need for you to worry." As we sat nervously in the kitchen waiting for my grandfather to come back, she explained what was happening. She told me there was a dangerous thing that was haunting the area. They called it Hachisakutsama because of its height. In Japanese, Hachisakutsama means 8 feet tall. It takes on the appearance of an extremely tall woman, and it makes a sound like ho, 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 in a deep male voice. It appears slightly differently depending on who sees it. Some say it looks like a haggard old woman in a kimono, and others say it is a girl in a white funeral shroud. One thing that never changes is its height and the sound it makes. A long time ago, it was captured by monks, and they managed to confine it in a ruined building on the outskirts of the village. They trapped it using 4 small religious statues called jizos that they placed at the north, south, east, and west of the ruins, and it wasn't supposed to be able to move from there. Somehow it managed to escape. The last time it appeared was 15 years ago. My grandmother said that anyone who saw 8 feet tall was destined to die within a few days. It all sounded so crazy, I wasn't sure what to believe. When Grandpa came back, there was an old woman with him. She introduced herself as Kei-san and handed me a small crumpled piece of parchment saying, "Here, take this and hold it." Then, she and Grandpa went upstairs to do something. I was left alone in the kitchen with my grandmother again. I needed to go to the toilet. Granny followed me to the bathroom and wouldn't let me shut the door. I was beginning to get really frightened by all of this. After a while, Grandpa and Kei-san took me upstairs and brought me into my bedroom. The windows were covered in newspaper, and lots of ancient runes had been written on them. There were small bowls of salt in all 4 corners of the room, and a small Buddha figure placed at the center of the room on top of a wooden box. There was also a bright blue bucket. "What's the bucket for?" I asked. "That's for your pee and poo," Grandpa replied. Kei-san sat me down on the bed and said, "Soon, the sun will be setting, so listen carefully. You must stay in this room until tomorrow morning. You must not come out under any circumstances until 7 o'clock tomorrow morning. Your grandmother and your grandfather will not speak to you or call you until then. Remember, do not leave the room for any reason until then. I will let your parents know what is going on." She spoke in such a grave tone that all I could do was quietly nod my head. "You have to follow Kei-san's instructions to the letter," Grandpa told me, "and never let go of the parchment she gave you. And if anything happens, pray to Buddha, and make sure you lock this door when you leave." They walked out into the hallway, and after saying goodbye to them, I closed the bedroom door and locked it. I turned on the TV and tried to watch, but I was so nervous, I felt sick to my stomach. Grandma had left me some snacks and rice balls for me, but I couldn't eat them. I felt like I was in prison, and I was very depressed and scared. I lay down on the bed and waited. Before I knew it, I was asleep. When I woke up, it was just after 1 a.m. All of a sudden, I realized that something was tapping on the window. Tap, 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 tap. I felt the blood draining from my face, and my heart skipped a beat. I desperately tried to calm myself down, telling myself it was just the wind playing tricks, or maybe the branches of a tree. I turned up the volume on the TV to drown out the tapping noise. Eventually it stopped altogether. That's when I heard Grandpa calling me. "Are you okay in there?" he asked. "If you're scared, you don't have to stay in there all alone. I can come in and keep you company." I smiled and rushed over to open the door, but then I stopped in my tracks. I had goosebumps all over my body. It sounded like Grandpa's voice, but somehow it was different. I couldn't tell what it was, but I just knew. "What are you doing?" Grandpa asked. "You can open the door now." I glanced to my left, and a chill went down my spine. The salt in the bowls was slowly turning black. I backed away from the door. My whole body was trembling with fear. I fell to my knees in front of the Buddha statue and clutched the piece of parchment tightly in my hand. I started desperately praying for help. "Please save me from Hachisaku-sama," I wailed. Then I heard the voice outside the door. "Pull, pull, pull, pull." The tapping on the window started up again. I was overcome by fear and I crouched there in front of the statue, half crying and half praying for the rest of the night. I felt like it would never end. But eventually it was morning. The salt in all 4 bowls was pitch black. I checked my watch. It was 7:30 a.m. I cautiously opened the door. Grandma and Kei-san were standing outside waiting for me. When she saw my face, Grandma burst into tears. "I'm so glad you're still alive," she said. I went downstairs and was surprised to see my father and mother sitting in the kitchen. Grandpa came in and said, "Hurry up, we've got to get going." We went to the front door and there was a large black van waiting in the driveway. Several men from the village were standing around it, pointing at me and whispering, "That's the boy." The van was a 9-seater and they put me in the middle, surrounded by 8 men. Kei-san was in the driver's seat. The man on my left looked down at me and said, "You've got yourself in quite a spot of trouble. I know you're probably worried. Just keep your head down and your eyes shut. We can't see it, but you can. Don't open your eyes until we've got you safely out of here." Grandpa drove in front and my dad's car was following behind. When everyone was ready, our little convoy started moving. We were going fairly slow, around 20 kilometers per hour or maybe less. After a while, Kei-san said, "This is where it gets hard," and started muttering a prayer under her breath. That was when I heard the voice. "Pull, pull, pull, pull." I clutched the parchment Kei-san had given me tightly in my hand. I kept my head down, but I peeked outside. I saw a white dress fluttering in the breeze. It was moving along with the van. It was Hachisaku-sama. She was outside the window, but she was keeping pace with us. Then, suddenly she bent down and peered into the van. "No," I gasped. The man beside me shouted, "Close your eyes." I immediately shut my eyes as hard as I could and tightened my grip on the piece of parchment. Then the tapping began. Tap, 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 tap. And the voice became louder. "Pull, pull, pull, pull." There was tapping on the windows all around us. All of the men in the van were startled and on edge, muttering nervously to themselves. They couldn't see 8 feet tall, and they couldn't hear her voice, but they could hear her tapping on the windows. Kei-san started praying louder and louder until she was almost shouting. The tension inside the van was unbearable. After a while, the tapping stopped and the voice disappeared. Kei-san looked back at us and said, "I think we're safe now." All of the men around me breathed a sigh of relief. The van pulled over to the side of the road and the men got out. They transferred me into my dad's car. My mother held me close and tears were running down her cheeks. Grandpa and my father bowed to the men and they went on their way. Kei-san came to the window and asked me to show her the piece of parchment she had given me. When I opened my hand, I saw that it had gone completely black. "I think you will be okay now," she said. "But just be sure, hold on to this for a while." She handed me a new piece of parchment. After that, we drove straight to the airport and Grandpa saw us safely on the plane. When we took off, my parents breathed a sigh of relief. My father told me he had heard about 8 feet tall before. Years ago, his friend had been liked by her. The boy disappeared and was never seen again. My father said there were other people who had been liked by her and lived to tell about it. They all had to leave Japan and settle down in foreign countries. They were never able to go back to their homeland. She always chooses children as her victims. They say it's because children are dependent on their parents and family members. This makes them easier to deceive when she poses as their relatives. He said the men in the van were all blood relatives of mine, and that's why they had been sitting all around me, and why my father and grandpa had been driving in front and in back. It was all done to try and confuse Hachisaku-sama. It took a while to contact everyone and get them all together, so that's why I had to be confined in that room all night. He told me that one of the little Jizo statues, the ones that were meant to keep her trapped, had been broken, and that's how she escaped. It gave me chills. I was glad when we finally got back home. All of this happened more than 10 years ago. I haven't seen my grandparents since then. I haven't been able so much as to set foot in the country. Afterwards, I could call them every few weeks and talk to them on the phone. Over the years, I tried to convince myself that it was just an urban legend, that everything that happened was just some elaborate prank. But sometimes, I'm not so sure. My grandfather died 2 years ago. When he was sick, he wouldn't allow me to visit him, and he left strict instructions in his will that I wasn't to attend his funeral. It was all very sad. My grandmother called a few days ago. She said that she had been diagnosed with cancer. She missed me terribly and wanted to see me one last time before she died. "Are you sure, Grandma?" I asked. "Is it safe?" "It's been 10 years, she said. All that happened a long time ago. It's all forgotten. You're all grown up now. I'm sure there won't be a problem." But what about Hachisaku-sama? I asked. For a moment, there was silence on the other end of the phone. Then I heard a deep, masculine voice saying,
Po, po, po.